Hi, everyone. Welcome to Module 5, Bilingualism, Biliteracy, and Cognition. You'll notice I changed the venue. We're in my office today. And so I'm going to get to this PowerPoint and get things going. So let's see here. Okay, Module 5, Bilingualism, Biliteracy, and Cognition. So we'll start with cognition. Cognition broadly deals with a few things. This is just a couple of them, so I don't pretend to be doing an exhaustive sort of review of cognition here, but cognition basically refers to functionality within the brain. So in your head, sort of thinking, controlling, reflecting, things of that nature refer to cognition. Two dimensions of cognition that I'm just going to talk about today. One is executive functioning and the other is metalinguistic awareness. We're really going to be focusing more on metalinguistic awareness, but I think it's important to know something about this notion of executive functioning because it has made its way into schools, and a lot of times we may start seeing, or we are starting to see, curricula that are developed around promoting executive functioning skills in kids. So executive functioning typically is comprised in the literature of three different domains. One is self-regulation and inhibition, so being able to control yourself, basically. Can you stop yourself from screaming or from punching the student next to you, or from hugging someone uncontrollably in an inappropriate context? That ability to self-regulate, to inhibit, is one dimension of executive functioning. Another is working memory. This is pretty straightforward, but can you hold things in your working memory? This is particularly important. It's been shown for reading, where you've got to keep information in working memory, particularly in short-term working memory, so that you can keep drawing on it as you get more information from reading texts. In research, working memory is often measured through things like backward digit spans, that is, count backwards from 52, or someone will give you a series of numbers and you have to repeat them backwards from the order they gave them to you in. So 1, 7, 9, 3, 5, and then you have to go, I can't even do it, 5, 3, 9, 7, 1, right? You have to hold that in your working memory. Mine appears to be somewhat compromised, and be able to go backwards. So you have to do a couple of things. One is hold it in working memory. The second thing is you have to be flexible in your thinking. So you have to be flexible enough to be able to hold it there, and then also flexible to walk it backwards, to recount it backwards. So that flexibility of thinking is important, and there's also work, around just being able to think outside the box. Do people think differently? Oftentimes with assessments, kids will get categorization tasks, and some people categorize things in fundamentally different ways than the majority of people would do. That is, if you give people, a duck, a dog, and two other animals, they might not say that those are animals, but they might categorize them on some other dimension. They have claws or something like that. That's a little bit more flexibly thinking, a little bit more outside the norm. So that's executive functioning. Metalinguistic, and I'll talk a little bit about that in subsequent slides. Metalinguistic awareness is linguistic flexibility, the ability to reflect on the properties of language and manipulate them to certain degrees. So I'm going to talk about both of these things, particularly as they relate to bilingualism and bilingual learners. But quickly, bilingualism and biliteracy, we've been talking about this, and these are just reminders, but bilingual is speaking both of your languages regularly across various social and institutional domains. So lots of people define it as, you must use both of your languages every day to be considered bilingual. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that is one definition. It often gets used, as we've discussed, in different domains with different levels of proficiency that vary by language and by domain. Biliterate would be having degrees of ability to read and or write in both of those languages in some way, shape, or form. Again, this can vary as a function of context. these degrees of bilingualism vary. So school settings, home settings, church, grocery stores, and restaurants. So when we talk about all of these things, cognition can also vary as a function of context. So executive function, this idea, again, of these three domains, self-regulation and inhibition. Bilinguals are thought to perform better than monolinguals due to their regular switching of languages based on context. So bilinguals need to know, oh, I'm in this context, so now I'm going to speak Hmong. I'm not going to speak English. So they need to inhibit the English and just speak Hmong. Or they're with people who speak both and they know that they don't need to inhibit as much. They can just let languages flow. Or they might be at school where the language of schooling is in English, so you need to inhibit the Hmong in order to succeed at school. The fact that bilinguals have to do that is thought to enhance their self-regulatory abilities more broadly as a matter of cognition. Right? So you hear a lot about this, sort of the cognitive benefits of bilingualism. That's one of them, self-regulation and inhibition. Working memory, however, is not really seen to be differentiated by bilingual or monolingual status. There's nothing about being bilingual that improves your working memory in any way, shape, or form. However, being bilingual is thought to have improved flexibility of thinking for similar reasons as for inhibition. That is, you've got to be working across languages and contexts, and that sort of accrues to you being a more flexible thinker, and importantly, a more flexible user of language, which brings us to metalinguistic awareness. That extends the flexibility of thinking directly into language, so it merges those two. And you'll remember we saw the TED Talk of Boroditsky talking about how language influences thought. That's within specific languages that, the way a language is constructed may affect the way you think about snow. For example, if you've got 90 different words for snow, you're thinking differently about snow than if you just have like snow and slush and sleet. And that's sort of the end of the story. So being able to think more flexibly about language is another dimension of bilingualism, where if you're moving back and forth across languages, you are naturally going to make insights about language that your monolingual counterparts typically would not make. And there is research on this, much like on self-regulation and inhibition, that does show that bilinguals have an advantage in terms of metalinguistic awareness. This is also important, as we'll see later in the course, for instruction. It's an opportunity to work with bilinguals around metalinguistic content where working with monolinguals might not be as successful. So there's many ways to think about metalinguistic awareness, and I'm going to go through 4 of them. You can think about it phonologically, morphologically, syntactically, and semantically. So each one phonologically. So this, and I'll give you within intralinguistic examples, that is within a single language example of what metalinguistic awareness looks like. So phonologically, metalinguistic awareness, this is the most basic dimension of it. And so, for example, when we assess kids for phonological awareness, which is a form of metalinguistic awareness, you say, take the k sound in cat and replace it with a b. What new word do you get? And the child will say, bat, because they're mentally manipulating the sounds to create a new word. That mental manipulation is being metalinguistically aware. And phonological awareness is, I would argue, the most basic dimension of metalinguistic awareness. It's the easiest one. You see it within and across languages, within monolinguals and bilinguals. Next is morphological. So morphologically, you have, we've talked about this in previous courses, previous modules, root words plus plurals. Remember, that's inflectional. And past tense, that's inflectional morphology. Compound words, which is compound morphology, like toothbrush. And then prefixes and suffixes with a root word is derivational morphology. And morphological awareness is a more complex form of metalinguistic awareness. Kids can learn to play with language. And this is an example I'd like to give you. This is my son and my father, his grandfather. My son's name is Toby, and this was a long time ago, I must say. when he was 4.5 years old. So Toby is my son's name, and that is short for Tobias. And so one weekend we were visiting my parents with my son Toby, and he had just started talking. Now, parents listening will listen to that and be like, "What?" Yep, he didn't talk until he was 4. He had apraxia of speech, which the speech pathologist will understand is a difficulty sort of making sounds with your mouth. That was accompanied also by language processing disorder, which made it hard to comprehend a lot of language, and also developmental delay. And you put all those 3 things together and you get late talkers. And so Toby at age 4 had just started to talk. And so he's now talking in his unique way. And everyone's sort of rejoicing over that. And so we are visiting my parents, and as a joke, we're calling Toby by his full name, Tobias. So, hello, Tobias. And, it's teasing him a little bit. He thinks it's funny. We think it's funny. It's all very cute. And so my father's grandparent name is Poppy. So all weekend long, we're teasing Toby, calling him Tobias. And he thinks it's funny. And so then we're getting ready to leave, and we're in the car, and Toby's in the car. And my dad walks up to him, leans in the window, and he says, "Bye-bye, Tobias." And Toby looks at him, and he says, "Bye-bye, Papayas." And so what he did there was morphological, because you can see if you take Toby and you get to Tobias, you are doing a morphological, you are deriving a new form of the word. You're replacing the Y with an IAS, much like with Poppy, you're replacing the Y with an IAS. So when Toby made that morphological switch, just off the top of his head, I felt like, okay, this boy will eventually read. That is an example of interlinguistic, metalinguistic awareness at the morphological level. Syntactically, metalinguistic awareness can function similarly. If you remember our translation activity from Module 3, when you looked at "Meine Mutter ist intelligent," my mother is a smart, intelligent, you can do a very simple metalinguistic calculation and come to the conclusion that "Meine Mutter ist intelligent" means my mother's intelligent. When you look at the second sentence that is more syntactically complex, that's when your metalinguistic awareness really kicks in. You start thinking about, well, what are the different linguistic strategies I'm using to try and make sense of this sentence? And everything you're doing, leveraging your English language knowledge to make sense of that sentence, is a metalinguistic activity. Trying to wrestle with language to make better sense of language by understanding language is the essence of metalinguistic awareness. Semantically, so Zipke, the article you read, is an example of semantic metalinguistic awareness, this use of riddles. But I wanted to give you, so you can think about that in the context of your reading, that reading is meant to be an instructional example of how to do semantic metalinguistic instruction. But look at this little piece of text down below. And so another metalinguistic activity. I want you to think about, what does the word Plastiker mean in this sentence? I just made this word up. You cannot break this word apart morphologically because I just made it up. It's not like a combination of plas and tucker. It has nothing to do with taking. It's just a complete pseudo word, made up word. What I want you to do is talk to each other, pause this video in a second, and talk to each other and come up with as many potential synonyms for Plastiker that you can come up with, and think about why you're saying that. Why do you think that's a synonym? What's the reasoning for the synonym, for that particular synonym? So press pause and discuss this for just a moment. Okay, I'm assuming you've now hit play. Plastiker, the real word from the text, is monologuist. So like his mother, he was a monologuist. His subject was himself and the myriad dangers of the road, all that sort of stuff. So if you think about it with Plastiker, you don't have any kind of morphological cues to use here. You can only use semantic cues. That is the different words that are surrounding. And we hear this all the time, don't we? In instructional approaches, use context to make sense of words. And that is a metalinguistic strategy to use. But another one built in, if the word is sort of robust to it, is the morphological strategy. So you could use the same semantic metalinguistic approaches you use to get Platzdrucker, but then you also have the real word, monologist. You can break it apart. Monologue plus IST equals monologist. IST means one who, so it must mean one who tends to monologue, right? And then if you've got that working for you, then the semantic part is confirmatory, that this person likes to talk a lot. Specifically, he likes to monologue about himself and how heroic he is and things of that nature. So that's an activity, that's an example of a sort of a mixture of a semantic and a morphological awareness, metalinguistic awareness activity. And the thing about metalinguistic awareness is that it is associated with reading comprehension. So this is some work that I have done with my colleague Rebecca Silverman. And what we found was, when you look at reading comprehension amongst bilingual kids and amongst monolingual kids, that even when you take into account their vocabulary knowledge and their decoding skills, that morphology, semantics, and syntax, those are metalinguistic skills. Those are all predictive of reading comprehension. The heuristic here is if it's pointing at reading comprehension, it is a predictor of reading comprehension. I mean, more skill in that means better reading. So vocabulary and decoding are, of course, very important. We all know that. We all teach decoding. We typically teach vocabulary. We don't always teach morphology, semantics, and syntax, and we don't teach it necessarily metalinguistically. And bilingual kids are better at metalinguistic stuff than monolingual kids on average. So it's an instructional leverage point for working with bilingual kids, no matter what context you teach in, monolingual or bilingual. Now, thinking about making it about two languages. And some of you may have heard about bridging by a duo called Beeman and Urau. And we'll do a little more with that, particularly in the capstone class if you're doing the full endorsement. But if you think about it, this is why bilinguals are better at doing metalinguistics. They've got more linguistic material to work with than a monolingual person. So making it about two languages, you can think about metalinguistics intralinguistically within a single language or cross-linguistically across language. Monolinguals can do intra, but bilinguals can do both, intra and cross, which opens up possibilities to develop it. And like we said before, better metalinguistic awareness is associated with improved reading and writing outcomes. And so here's like a teaser. Bridging is an instructional technique for cross-language metalinguistic awareness. So you can see with this little picture here, you've got, this is basic, this is like first grade stuff with phonological and phonemic metalinguistic awareness. So English, you have apple, animal, alligator, after, attic, axe. But in Spanish, you've got avión, abeja, amarillo, azul, anaranjado, animal, águila, amor. And you can see what it says above, different sounds, sonidos diferentes. Trying to say, hey, look, English and Spanish both have the letter A, but that A makes a different sound, makes different sounds if depending on the language that you're in. Same with the letter I, with the poster next to it. Right, so getting kids to do those linguistic comparisons is critical to developing metalinguistic awareness. And finally, now for the activity, thinking, let's bring in academic language, because people are always talking about academic language and we don't really know what that is. We sort of tend to know what it isn't. And apologies, this slide is a little fuzzy, but I think we can make sense of it. What I want you to do is check out the assignment for this module and think about how metalinguistics interact with academic language, or at least one view of academic language as represented in an assessment. And so the instructions for the activity are on the module. I won't go over them here. I would just at this point refer you back to the module and say, just as a preview, you're going to be taking an academic language test that consists of 9 different tasks, all structured around these dimensions here: organizing analytic text, connecting ideas logically, tracking participants and themes, interpreting writers' viewpoints, understanding metalinguistic vocabulary, and unpacking dense information. So clearly, understanding metalinguistic vocabulary is going to be a metalinguistic skill, but some of these other tasks tap metalinguistic awareness also. And so within your group, print out this test, take it together, analyze it, tear it apart, and then use the graphic organizer to rate each task on the test on a 1 to 10 metalinguistic scale, 10 being highly metalinguistic, 1 being not particularly metalinguistic, and explain why you gave it that score. That's the task. And then upload that to the course page. And that's the end of Module 5's lecture. So have a look. I'll look forward to reading your rationales. Also at the end of that graphic organizer, there's a space at the bottom asking you whether or not you think this assessment is in fact a good indicator, a good global indicator, if you put all of those tasks together, of academic language. This will be something we'll talk about in our face-to-face meeting that takes into account Module 5. So good luck, everybody, and I'll look forward to reading your stuff.